Good morning. We'll get started, and thank you everybody for coming. I especially want to thank our committee. I don't want to mention everybody's name because I'll forget somebody, but this is the second year in a row that this committee took the ball and put this together, and it's a lot of work and a lot of time on their part, and I just want to thank them. I think we've got another very interesting, informative, packed day, and we're glad you all should come. I think a few of us have been here probably too long as far as being involved in the organization, and it just so happens our moderator, Bain Welker, is the guy that gets a lot of credit for making this organization what it is and giving it the credibility that it has. And, we came up with this moniker some time ago that it's your seat at the table. And I think as time goes on, we see that more and more. We meet with the sales companies when we need to. We have other organizations reach out to us, like the Jockey Club and the KTA. When issues come up, they recognize the CBA as being an important contingent that represents a very important faction of the industry. So, I think you can rest assured that you may not hear from us a lot. I kind of use the analogy that we're like a fire station. We have a fire truck that's ready to come out when we have to come out. And, but believe me, when issues come up, you'll be the first to know. The preferred providers are here today, and I'd encourage you to visit with them and talk to them. It's funny, after the September sale, I got an email from one of our board members that how much money he saved by using his preferred providers, and that's what they're here for. So I'd encourage you to visit with them today. The organization is in a good financial position. That's why, as a member, you're able to attend this free of charge. And our goal is to keep the dues low. And certainly the board doesn't see any reason any of that should change. I'd encourage you to reach out to a board member if you have any issues, if you have any suggestions of what you'd like to see the CBA do. Certainly that's why they're there. We represent you and would be anxious to hear from you. That's really about all I have to do. I'm going to introduce our moderator, Bain Welker, who's going to introduce Damon Thayer. We're fortunate to have Damon here. He's the Senate Majority Floor Leader, so he holds a very important position in Frankfurt. He's a big supporter and advocate of the industry, and I'll turn it over to Bain.
Thank you, Craig. Good morning. Several years ago, in its infancy, when the CBA was just merely a thought and being talked over and kind of scribbled out on napkins and discussed at lunches and different dinners, it's pretty amazing to see how far it's come today and the people that have had the backbone and have kept this thing going. It's built on sweat equity. A lot of people do a lot of work to keep it together. And as Craig said, let me just give a few of those. Callan Strauss, who I believe chaired the committee to put this event on today. Pat Costello, who played a huge role. Jody Huckabee, Wayne Sweezy, and always the glue to this organization, Nicole Gibson. With that being said, when the CBA first evolved, what it did was everybody thought, why do we need another spaghetti organization when we already have so many other organizations out there that represent the thoroughbred industry? What the CBA has done is it allows like-minded individuals come together that are able to share issues relative to the sales scene. And that's the primary focus and impetus, along with a platform of education. We all know that the sales process is dynamic, it's ever-changing, and will continue to evolve as time moves forward. And I think we've seen in a very short period of time different technologies, new levels of testing, biomarkers for athletic performance, all these things that we thought were way off in the future when we first sat down and started talking about these issues are here, and they're upon us today. So what it allows is for everybody to be able to come together, share those, and be able to do continuing education projects and educate ourselves as sellers of a product as we are here today. So welcome to the second, which I hope will be the annual symposium of the CBA. At this time, I would like to introduce Damon Thayer, who's going to do our opening statements. Damon and I go back. Damon and I are actually colleagues from back in the 80s at Turfway Park. Damon was in the marketing department, and I was the stakes coordinator. I think we do share one thing. We got to at least have the one Derby winner that came through Turfway Park and Little ET. With that, I'm going to turn the podium over to Damon Thayer.
Good morning, everyone. Thanks for the opportunity to come back and address this great organization. I appreciate the work you do. We've had an opportunity to work together in the past on issues in Frankfurt. And as I was thinking about what I was going to say today, I thought, I've got a lot in common with the folks in this room. My guess is you're pretty much divided up into two groups. You're either Kentucky natives who were born and raised here and now came up through the horse industry and now making your way in the industry, or you're like me and you moved here from another state because you wanted to work in the horse business. And that's my story. I came here 22 years ago. I'd been working at the Maryland Jockey Club, Pimlico and Laurel, and pursued a childhood dream as a kid from northern Michigan. Came here to work at Turfway Park in the horse business. I remember that day in November of 1992. Drove across the Brent Spence Bridge, became a Kentuckian for the first time, and I knew about 10 people. I knew some folks who worked at Churchill Downs, and of course I knew the people who worked at Turfway. Along the way, I've had an opportunity to spend 8 years working at the Breeders' Cup, but also came to a fork in the road and decided to take it. Came up through local Republican Party politics, became vice chairman of the state Republican Party, and then 12 years ago, I got a call from the chairman of the Republican Party and said, we've got a seat in the state Senate that we're drawing and redistricting and we want you to run. And I said, well, that's not really in my life plan. But when you get a call from then Senator Jim Bunning and Mitch McConnell encouraging you to run, that's something you don't walk away from. So tomorrow, I will quietly note and celebrate 12 years since I was sworn into the Kentucky State Senate. And 2 years ago, I became the Senate Majority Floor Leader, which affirms my belief that this is the greatest country in the world, where a kid from northern Michigan can come to Kentucky and end up as Majority Floor Leader in the Kentucky State Senate. As my 17-year-old son would say, America. You know, the horse industry, when I came to Frankfurt 12 years ago, I was still working at the Breeders' Cup and started talking about things we could do to improve the business. And I started filing bills and using the bully pulpit that the legislature gives you to talk about some of these ideas. And I'll never forget the conversation I had with State Representative Tom Birch. He is one of the most left-wing liberal members of the Kentucky House of Representatives. He's from Louisville. He's been there for like 100 years. They love Obama in his district, so he's not going anywhere anytime soon. And he came up to me and he said, "Why do you want to help out these rich horse farmers?" And that really, in one sentence, summed up the perception of the horse business in Frankfurt. So I pulled out the study that had recently been done by the KTA that showed that the business is not made up of rich horse farmers. And you all know the numbers back then, probably hasn't changed that much, that the average horse farm owner netted about 50 grand a year, had 8 to 10 employees, carried over $1 million in debt, and made a significant economic contribution to Kentucky, in addition to us being the signature industry. And back then, it was also a negative to vote for alcohol bills, which I thought was kind of odd since bourbon is manufactured here in Kentucky. And I remember my first week on the job, I got called into a senior senator's office, and he said, "You know, we hear you're pretty conservative, so we're going to give you honorary membership in the Neanderthal caucus." Now, that was coming off of a Herald Leader editorial that showed Republicans as a bunch of knuckle-dragging Neanderthals. Well, I was proud of that. You know, I'm a pretty conservative right-wing Republican. So I took my membership card in the Neanderthal caucus and said, "Well, I'm off to a pretty good start here." But a week later, our first alcohol bill came to the floor of the session, and you know, I'm Catholic, so I'm like, yeah, this is a good thing. That was expand alcohol sales at catered events in dry territory. So I voted yes. Immediately, two of the elder statesmen in my party came up to me and they said, "You're no conservative. Give us back your membership card in the Neanderthal caucus." I said, "Well, what did I do?" "You voted for that alcohol bill." Well, I'm proud to say 12 years later that the attitudes in the General Assembly have changed regarding our signature industries. We have removed the ad valorem tax on aging bourbon barrels, and you can see the growth that is now occurring. One of the huge success stories in Kentucky is the growth of our bourbon industry. And helping create an environment for the horse industry to thrive is well accepted. Even Tom Birch doesn't give me a hard time anymore, Heedley, about trying to help out those quote-unquote rich horse farmers. So I thought I'd talk a little bit about some of the successes we've had, because I think sometimes our industry, we have a little bit of a chip on our shoulder about things that happen in Frankfurt and Washington, and I think that's unnecessary because we have had some big victories. And the CBA was right in the middle of one of those back in 2006. And I remember those days very well, working with Bain, working with Headley Bell and Reynolds Bell. For those of you who were around then, you'll remember there was the effort to bring more transparency to the dual agency process, but that turned into, well, we need to license bloodstock agents. Well, that was a really bad idea. That's just bringing more big government into the free enterprise system, and I'm not for that, and neither was the CBA. And believe me, I'm a member of the Licensing and Occupations Committee. You don't want to be licensed because all it does is breed infighting. It seems like every other year the cosmetologists and the hairdressers come to Frankfurt. And let me tell you, you haven't lived until you've seen a crowd like this size of hairdressers and cosmetologists fighting and scrapping amongst each other about their continuing education requirements. We don't want that for the horse business. So that thing was a juggernaut. It flew through the House of Representatives, and then President of the Senate, David Williams, was all for it. And I was still a rookie legislator, and I said, look, we can't pass this. And so I did what every legislator tries to do when you're trying to kill a bill. You stall, you filibuster, and you create an opportunity to bring everybody to the table and work out an agreement. And Headley, you remember that's exactly what we did. The gentleman who was pushing for this licensing was forced to come to the table. And what we did is we dropped the licensing component, but we did pass a strong dual agency bill that I think has benefited the integrity of the horse business tremendously. And if you look at the three things that the CBA stands for, integrity is one of them, and now we've got full transparency and disclosure with buyer and seller of dual agency opportunities that happen in this business. And that was a big victory, not only for what we did, but for what we didn't do. And sometimes in the business that I'm in, you can rack up victories on the bad bills that you kill. And I'm happy to wear the black hat every day and help kill those bad bills. You can't turn them into a TV commercial or a direct mail piece when you're running for re-election, because the voters want to know what you did, not what you didn't do. But some of my proudest moments in the legislature are killing bad bills that creates more bureaucracy and more regulation and more red tape for small businesses. And this was a key example of that, and a big victory in the early days of the CBA. One of the other victories we had, and I don't want to talk too much about expanded gambling. I think that ship has sailed. And I think those of us in the horse industry are realizing that it's not the panacea that we all thought it was, and that maybe Kentucky dodged a bullet by not having expanded gambling. When you look at what's happened in places like Pennsylvania, in Ontario, Canada, and Delaware, West Virginia, attempts to do in Indiana, where the legislature comes back and makes a money grab at the money that's been assigned to the horse business. Now look, I made my run at it. In 2012, I took on the leader of my own party, worked with the governor of the opposite party, trying to put a constitutional amendment on the ballot to bring expanded gambling to Kentucky. I've still got the scars from it, but you know, there comes a time when we all have to make our Declaration of Independence, and that's what I did at that time. And it was the right thing to do. But short of that, what are some ways that this industry can be competitive? One of the big answers is historical racing. The brand name, of course, Instant Racing. Back in 2009, I sent a letter to Attorney General Jack Conway, which asked for a legal opinion on whether or not historical horse racing was parimutuel wagering. And he agreed that it is. It's the only time in history that Jack Conway and I have agreed on anything. It'll probably be about the only time we agree on anything. And you all know how that's evolved. It's installed at Kentucky Downs, where it's doing gangbuster numbers. They're installed at Ellis Park, where the numbers are improving. We all know that Keeneland and the Red Mile are going to build a facility here in Lexington, where I think, if done right, it's going to do extremely well in this marketplace. We're just waiting for the court system to give its final approval to its legality. And the followers of the judicial branch have told me that they think it's a slam dunk. Now, I've learned never to trust the other branch of government very much when it comes to that, but let's hope that that happens. Last year, I was able to get language inserted into a revenue bill that set the tax rate at 1.5%, which is a reasonable tax rate for historical racing, and that is equivalent to the tax rate on regular parimutuel handle. And that will allow expansion at other tracks, I believe, when the court removes the uncertainty regarding its legality. But I'm proud that back in 2009 that I helped get the ball rolling on that by asking for that Attorney General's opinion. Just last year, we worked with David Schweitzer and the KTA. I see Chauncey here this morning, who's back from Australia to take over now that David's retired. And we changed the statute on the KTDF monies to allow KTDF funds to be used on non-claiming races, maiden races, and optional allowance claiming races to make us more competitive with that level of race at Indiana Grand in Shelbyville, Indiana. That was a big victory for the industry. Didn't get a lot of press coverage, but it's important in the war to keep horses from heading to other states with larger purses in a certain band of purse classification. As a member of the Equine Drug Research Council, appointed by Republican Governor Ernie Fletcher and twice reappointed by Democrat Steve Beshear, I have helped fight the battle on the medication front. Over the 10 years or so that I've been on that commission, making recommendations to the Racing Commission, we've eliminated non-steroidal anti-inflammatories from race day. We've eliminated steroids on race day. And Kentucky has gone from having a reputation of being the Wild West when it came to race day medication to being a leader on the race day medication issue. As a member of the EDRC, I voted to make the recommendation that we eliminate race day Lasix in stakes races here in Kentucky. Unfortunately, we haven't seen as much progress in that area as I would like. The Racing Commission voted that in, but has yet to pursue the regulations necessary to enact that, for Kentucky to be a real leader in the battle on race day medication. And I'm sure that there is divided opinion here in this room, but my opinion is we should eliminate Lasix on race day altogether. As a public relations person by trade, this issue is killing us in the eyes of the public. It's killing us. It gives the New York Times and PETA an opening where there should be none. And I follow this issue pretty closely, and I see the membership growing of the WOA organization, Water, Hay, Oats Association, and I agree in principle with the ideas put forward by that organization. I am just very reticent to throw my support behind federal regulation of the horse business. The last thing I want is a bunch of federal bureaucrats telling the horse business how to run the show. But I'm telling you folks, if we can't figure this out on a state-by-state basis, and I'm a big 10th Amendment guy. The 10th Amendment to the Constitution says that there's a handful of things that the federal government should do, and then the rest of it should be left to the states. And horse racing traditionally is left to state regulators, and I support that. But if we can't get our act together soon and figure out this medication issue, the federal government's going to take it over. And I think we will live to regret that if we're not careful. Because I don't think the federal government does very many things very well. But it's coming if we're not careful. And I think and you can go into the horse health issues, and those are some very legitimate claims. But as a PR guy, I'm telling you, the public perception on this is a big issue. We need to get a hold of it. We need to do the right thing. We need to eliminate all medications on race day and figure out a way for our industry to move forward. And you'll note that I say our industry. I'm still in the business. I run my own consulting firm. I've got horse clients. You know, I've worked at racetracks in Michigan, Ohio, Maryland, here in Kentucky, 8 years at the Breeders' Cup. I've even tried to sell a couple of horses on this stage. Matter of fact, I know the secret behind how to make a mare. Give her away. I had a mare. I wanted to dabble in the horse business. Sold a couple of weanlings here at Keeneland. One of them broke its maiden in Nebraska. Another one won a couple races at Evangeline Downs. And after spending my kid's college tuition while he was still in middle school on being in the horse breeding business, I gave the mare away to the UK equine program. And of course, you know what's happened. She's now had a couple of winners of maiden and allowance races down in South Florida. UK is getting some nice checks from the Breeders' Incentive Fund. And I've proved that old adage that the best way to make a mare is to give her away. So you heard me mention the Breeders' Incentive Fund, and that has to be my proudest accomplishment in my 12 years in the Kentucky State Senate. I'll never forget the day back in 2003, I came to a Kentucky Thoroughbred Farm Managers meeting, and I talked about eliminating the sales tax that we pay in Kentucky for breeding a mare to a stallion, 6%. Only state in the union that does that. I wanted to, as a good conservative Republican, I wanted to get rid of that tax. And then my friend David Hager came up to me after the meeting and he said, how about this idea? What if you redirected the tax into a fund, into a breeder's incentive fund? You know, we're getting a lot of competition from these other states who are subsidizing their breeders' incentive funds with casino profits. Why don't you look at doing it that way? Well, you talk about serendipity, everything coming together. Later that year, Ernie Fletcher was elected governor of Kentucky, and he was a very pro-horse industry governor. And we worked together on his tax modernization proposal that passed in 2005 that included the Kentucky Thoroughbred Breeders Incentive Fund as part of that law. Worked with the KTA, Kentucky Thoroughbred Farm Managers Club. Ken Wilkins was the president of the farm managers at the time, brought everybody to the table, and we have created a huge success. Since becoming law, the Kentucky Breeders Incentive Fund has returned $123 million to Kentucky breeders. That's helped pay, go ahead, Heedley, let's hear some agreement on that. That's helped pay a lot of vet bills, a lot of feed bills, a lot of blacksmith bills, a lot of advertising bills. And we've done what no other state has done, and we've brought in other breeds. And that's important because it's not only thoroughbreds that are critical to the horse industry economy. 80% of those dollars have come back to thoroughbred breeders. That's $97 million back in the pockets of thoroughbred breeders all over the world. We had to fight, you know, to not make it an isolationist, protectionist program. We want people to send their mares to Kentucky, board them here year-round, and breed them to our stallions. We don't care if they live in France or England or Ireland or Canada or Africa. It doesn't matter. We want their commerce here in Kentucky. And I'll never forget the day that Kerry Cawthon, then a member of the Kentucky Horse Racing Commission, came to my house, and over a bologna sandwich, we worked out the final regulatory agreement to make sure that this wasn't a protectionist program, that it recognized that Kentucky is an export state when it comes to bloodstock, and 80% of the horses who are bred here never race here. So we didn't want to make those breeders' incentive funds contingent on racing just at Kentucky tracks, because most breeders in Kentucky sell their horses to other people. They don't control where they eventually race. So we needed to make sure that it was not a protectionist deal and that it was wide open to breeders everywhere. And I believe that's been one of the greatest success stories that we've had in the horse business in recent years. We've done a lot of other good things for the horse business. We got $20 million in funding for the livestock disease diagnostic lab here at UK to expand that facility. We helped get the North American Racing Academy at KCTCS off the ground with some seed money. And we passed an adjuster's lien to allow owners of boarding facilities to auction abandoned horses in 45 days rather than 1 year. And we also established the Horse Farming Subcommittee to focus exclusively on issues impacting horse farmers. And there are a handful of you in this room who have testified before that committee to help educate legislators about how important this business is to the overall agriculture economy in Kentucky. And if I may rise to a point of personal privilege and be a little political, don't get nervous. Don't get nervous. I'm not going to get all anti-Obama on you. But we've got an opportunity this year to elect the most pro-horse racing governor we've ever had. My good friend Jamie Comer is running for governor on the Republican side. Several of you have worked with him. He is the first agriculture commissioner in the history of this Commonwealth to recognize the horse industry as an important part of the agriculture sector. And I guarantee you, if he's elected governor of Kentucky, the horse business is going to have a seat at the table when it comes to appointments to the Racing Commission and the Horse Park Commission, and making sure that we continue to understand in Frankfort, in the executive branch, how important this business is to the overall economy of this great Commonwealth. This year, we've got an issue that I'm spending some time on. A friend of many of us in the room, Brad Cummings, has an idea called Equilottery, an idea that would tie the results of a lottery game to the results of a horse race. And Brad is going all over the country trying to sell this idea to racing commissions, and he's being met with open arms. This is a great idea. And we've got a bill, I believe it's Senate Bill 79, sponsored by Senator Julie Adams in Louisville. I'm going to sign on as a co-sponsor later this afternoon, and next week we hope to move this bill out of committee to the floor of the Senate. This is an innovative idea that I believe will help increase the popularity of horse racing and increase purses. And that's what it's all about. We've got to keep Kentucky racing competitive, racing and breeding competitive. I believe things are looking up for our business. On the breeding side, I think we finally established some equilibrium on the supply and demand side. For a long time, it was out of whack with the supply way exceeding the demand. And I think we've got that sort of worked out. And you can see it where the prices here at the public auction houses have increased since the years of the recession. On the racing side, we're not there yet. We've not figured out the supply and demand on the racing side. Still too many race days, and with the smaller foal crops, you know, we're at foal crops now that are like they were back in the Secretariat days in the 1970s. That's not a bad thing, as you all know, in the business of selling horses. But the racetracks have to catch up, and we've all seen the numbers come out of Equibase. We're going to have to run a lot fewer races in this country because the bettors don't like 5- and 6-horse fields. So the racetracks are going to have to adjust their business model because we've got to present to the public 8-horse fields in order to get the public interested in betting. There's no place that does that better than here at Keeneland, but not everybody can replicate this great model that this facility has. So that's the challenge we face, declining parimutuel handle, declining foal crop. We're going to have to find equilibrium on the supply and demand side and come up with new and innovative products like instant racing and Equilottery to help make our business more competitive in the world of entertainment and sports gaming. I'm a believer in this business. I think it's the greatest game played outdoors. And at the end of the day, I'm just a kid from northern Michigan who fell in love with Spectacular Bid. We all have that horse who got us hooked on racing. Mine is Spectacular Bid, and if you follow me on Twitter, at Damon_Thayer, you'll know that I still think he's the greatest horse to ever look through a bridle. Remember, he was a Kentucky bred. Secretariat was a Virginia bred. You've got to give the nod to the Kentucky bred. But I believe in this business, and I'm unafraid to advocate for it in Frankfort. I'm also unafraid to be a voice for small business, and that's, at the end of the day, what each and every one of you is engaged in. Free enterprise, entrepreneurship, and those are the principles that I will continue to stand for as long as I'm in Frankfort. I want to make sure we keep government out of the way. I don't want to strangle government in the bathtub. I want it to run efficiently. I want it to work well. I don't want it to grow any bigger, and I'd like to make it a little bit smaller if we can. So those are the kinds of principles, as long as I'm in the Kentucky State Senate, which is the greatest honor of my life, to serve the people of my district and this entire state. And I'm happy to be recognized as the horse industry senator in the Kentucky General Assembly. I wish you all well this year in your business endeavors. And if you ever got anything that you want to talk to me about, I'm always accessible. and appreciate the opportunity to speak before you this morning. Thanks very much, and have a great symposium.
Thank you, Damon. Next, and to open up, we're going to introduce Chauncey Morris. Chauncey is going to share with us the responsibilities, the vision, and the direction of the KTA. Chauncey now serves as the Executive Director of the KTA and the KTOB. Chauncey has also been the former CEO of the Thoroughbred Beaters of Australia and Aushorse, which is Australia's marketing arm. Prior to that, Chauncey served in a marketing associate capacity with Keeneland and is very instrumental in getting the emerging markets program up and off the ground, which has added $500 million into sales since that inception. So in order to keep us on pace and keep the schedule going, let me introduce Chauncey Morris.
Thank you, Bain. Senator's leaving us. I'll talk more about him later. I just want to thank him for everything that he does for our industry. Well, it's like I'm talking to a bunch of old friends. Thank you for having me this morning. I'm going to talk first about where the Commonwealth stands right now in the national picture, what all of you and your families dedicate yourselves to is breeding the best horses in the world. Numbers-wise, there's some very interesting trends that are going on. According to the Jockey Club, the foal crop, the last reported foal crop is at 7,700. We're on track, if the numbers stay right, to hit 10,000 again in the next few years. There's a lot of going for Kentucky's favor. Some of those state bred programs in Pennsylvania and Louisiana, they've been losing some gaming revenue. So there's been a flight to excellence after the Great Recession, where we have a world-class infrastructure of breeding farms and veterinary services, so much so that in 2013 to 2014, the number of mares that were covered here in Kentucky in 15,781, which is 45.1% of the national average. In 2014, that number rose to 16,894, to 48.2% of the national average. The national number of mares being covered. As Damon said quite rightly, there's been consolidation. So we in Kentucky, even though we're the registrar for the KTDF program, like to see our stallions cover mares. Then they go out and come in. It's this ingress-egress that causes a lot of commerce. As far as racing, you can see how much Kentucky has risen and other states have receded. In 1994, some might say the boom years, the starters in the United States were 69,577. In that same year, the starters that were Kentucky bred were 13,965. In 2014, national starters, 51,695. Those that are Kentucky bred, 16,000. We're breeding more horses. We have to find places that these horses go. One of the places, thanks to historic gaming and the revenue that it's created, is back to Kentucky. Since 94 to 2014, the starters at Kentucky tracks, that horse population has actually stayed constant. But the number of Kentucky-bred starters that aren't making their starts here in Kentucky, never ever come back home, as it were, has actually increased. Now, some may say it's because the national average is declining and we're breeding more horses. But with programs like the Kentucky Thoroughbred Development Fund and the historic racing revenue that's going back to that, we want to see those horses come here back home and make starts so we can have full fields. So to change gears here, How many people in the past 3 weeks looked at the IFHA ratings? The Longines World, yep, okay, show of hands. How many folks also would have read John Gosden's commentary in Thoroughbred? Okay, quite a few. There's two things that I want to speak to specifically about this, is that the world has obviously changed. IFHA ratings in 2008, top of the heap was Curlin, followed by New Approach, then Raven's Pass, ours, Big Brown, ours, obviously, Henry the Navigator, and then Good Baba, which is an older horse that, as an American horse, campaigned all its life in Hong Kong. You saw that the latest iteration of the IFHA ratings, top of the heap was Japan, and it went Europe and Australia. And there's a lot of things that are going on. You can agree or disagree with how these are tabulated, but they do act as a barometer of telling you where commercial breeding is right now, where it's profitable, where it's vital, where it's vibrant, the jurisdictions where everything is working. It's a little different than when this guy was there. But then we still have horses like this guy that we can produce, that all of you produce. One of the things I learned in Australia is how some of these emerging jurisdictions, if you will, got to the top of the heap. In Australia, they've been breeding horses for over 200 years down there. But one of the things that really raised their profile was a horse called Choisir. And then, of course, Takeover Target and Miss Andretti. They made it, they internalized as a country that we are going to raid horses, the races at Royal Ascot, the sprint races, Prince of Wales Stakes, Queen Anne, and make a name for ourselves. And in doing so, they've created one of the most vibrant stallion markets and commercial markets in the world. This was something that was planned. It's very similar to Japan, where you have Epiphania and the other horse eludes me, but these were by a son of Sunday Silence and a son of Chris S. that sold right here in this ring. These lists, all these things that we're talking about right now are because other industries have been very, very good at telling their story. There's a reason that they've been very good at telling their story. They're a little bit better funded than we are. They also have a vehicle that always positively communicates what their horses are doing well, either commercially or on the racetrack or in the ring or in the breeding shed, if you will. You should have a look at that. It's eye-opening. So how do we compete in this new world? Well, if you isolate what Japan and Australia did, there were 4 things that they really did. They started communicating with one voice about the success of their horses. They made a common goal of where they were going to send their horses. Oftentimes the JRA or others were actually facilitating payment and presence at the races like the Melbourne Cup and the Arc de Triomphe. They were able to bring buyers into their sales, and they were also able to do some generic marketing that were outside of the sales that just told you how great Japan was, how great Australia was. I know that because I did that for 3 years. What can we do here? Well, we have a lot of very positive things going for us still. As I said, those pedigrees that are in the IFHA ratings, there's a lot of American blood still there. There's a lot of places around the world that we don't really consider where American horses might be that they're performing very well. For instance, the Hong Kong Jockey Club. Everybody's always said, each industry, if it was the Australians saying that the Americans would never come, or if it was here saying that we would never get the market share in South America or what have you. One of the last frontiers for the American thoroughbred has always been Hong Kong. They don't like our horses. The population there is very different. The racing conditions are very different. So just to tell you a little bit about the Hong Kong Jockey Club. It's 1,223 horses currently in training. 67 of those horses were sold through the international sale. They call them international sales graduates. 604 horses were acquired by PPs. Those are privately purchased. They have to make a start somewhere else and then get a retinue of Hong Kong Jockey Club handicappers to rate these horses. Then they say, yeah, okay, you can come in, you can't. It's 589 that were acquired by PPG, private purchase Griffins. These are horses, the Hong Kong Jockey Club member, they get the license for the PPG. They're able to go to any sale in the world or even privately and say, want to buy a horse. You have to get it up to, as they say, trialing, right before the horse gets its first start as a 2-year-old, and then it can be export or imported into Hong Kong. So currently among this 1,200 horse population, there are 35 U.S. horses. Last Wednesday at Happy Valley in a Class 2, so most of the horses there, they're older horses, and it's usually male horses, colts, older horses, and geldings. It's a handicap system, Class 1 being the best, Class 5 being sort of the ones that you want to get out of. There was a 5-year-old Warfront and a 4-year-old Miss and Mast, both Kentucky breds, hit the exacta in a Class 2 at Happy Valley. If we had some sort of vehicle that could shout from the rooftops or go to those owners and remind them that, look, there are 35 American horses here. There are horses like California Memory. There are horses like Good Baba that have performed at the top of the game. This is a very valuable market, valuable yearling market now around the world. We could probably try to claw back or increase our market share a little bit beyond the 35 U.S. horses there. So how do we do that? Well, one of the things that a working group between KTOB and CBA have been doing is looking at the best manner to achieve this goal. We've isolated 4 things. It's retaining our current buying bench. It's increasing the number of U.S.-based Kentucky-bred horses racing abroad. Increasing the number of Kentucky bloodstock professionals overseas at sales and races. Bringing the best back home, as it were. You know, we've always never been really a parochial industry. This has been the most forward-looking industry. You go through the waves. Everybody might have the thoroughbred racing book in America. And you see the waves from Nasrullah beforehand or afterwards of the best stock coming here. That's always been a tradition and one that's very strong. There's been a lot of outside investment lately by the likes of the Goodmans or the Bankies or anyone that, there's a lot of folks here in this audience that have been going to TATS or going to Australia or even going to Japan, bringing the best back home here. That's always the ultimate goal. That's something that we should reinforce. And we still compete at the top of the game. Horses like this and Wesley. But if you were to take my comments and say that we only need to race abroad or we only need to retain our buying bench and we only need to get new people to the sales, we can't do that. It's a chair. It's these 4 pillars. They have to stand the same. These existential questions that we've come up with right now in our industry, it's not confined to our industry, and there's been other industries in the history of American business that have gone through these things before. So,
Abby, wonderful.
guy in the blue coat was Henry Ford II. In the 1960s, he wanted to buy Ferrari. Enzo Ferrari started to back out of the deal and say, I'll let you buy the brand, but I still want to be able to race under Ferrari at Le Mans. Ford's pulled out of the deal. Mr. Ford also went to his engineers and said, build me a car that beats the crap out of any car ever made. And in 1965, the Ford GT40 hit the trifecta. 1, 2, 3, those were separate teams. We're at that moment now where there's so many positive things still about this industry and what we do. And moreover, we're going to have an increased foal crop, and we got to find new places to sell them. So that's all my comments right now. As I said, we are looking at options currently. We, the KTOB, will bring some solutions to the next CBA board meeting, and would like your consideration. Thank you very much.
If there are any questions, we do have a few minutes that you'd like to present to Chauncey. Have a show of hands. You're lucky. You're off the hook. Our next panel is going to be the business of our business. And that panel will be made up of Jen Shaw, who's an equine specialist at Dean, Dorton, Allen, and Ford, Del Pearson of M&J Insurance, and Mike Moser of Miller, Griffin, and Marks.
Good morning. Well, I always say we're here to talk about the most exciting part of horse ownership, and that's the taxes and the business piece, but I'm not sure that the majority of the room will agree with me. So bear with us. It is one of those things where it's very important. It's the bottom line. And so it's a bit more mundane ideas and topics that we'll cover here in the next little bit. But again, hopefully you'll take something out of it. And I've sort of focused on a variety of different topics that we're seeing our clients face in the way of accounting and new tax law, things like that. So there's a lot of materials to cover. I'll probably cover at a high level rather than getting into the mundane details. But if you have questions after the presentation, I'll certainly be available to take direct questions outside. So with that being said, I'll go through a PowerPoint here. We also, in your materials, we have a handout as well that sort of follows the PowerPoint. So feel free to utilize that as well. Some of the items we'll be talking about are just a general, from a tax perspective, structuring breeding and sales operations. I'll make one or two comments on that. Then talking about some tax compliance matters. We've got some new tangible asset and repair regulations that we're dealing with for 2014. A hot button topic in the industry, worker classification, employee versus independent contractor from a tax perspective, 1099 reporting requirements, and just a brief sales and use taxes reminder. And then we'll end on a positive note and talk about some of the tax incentives that are currently available for those in the equine business. Just a quick note on structuring breeding and sales operations. Mike would and his group would know more about the legal aspects, but just one item to consider. In 2013, it was the first year we had the new, what's referred to as the Obamacare tax, which is the 3.8% on passive investments and investment income, and then a 0.9% on self-employment income. What this has done is sort of made the S corporation a more attractive option for those that are in the purely service business. So your trainers, your vets, perhaps bloodstock agents. We've seen more kind of gravitate towards this S corporation. So if it's something that you haven't considered for 2013, you may want to consider that going forward. But there's a variety of different options, and I've listed them in order from least liability protection to probably greatest, and probably least complex to most complex. The new tangible asset regulations, it's one that's, it's sort of here. Unfortunately, we have to deal with it in 2014. It's an example of regulations that were formed or passed as a result of large corporations. So large corporations were going out, getting their independent asset studies done, and there was no consistency. So unfortunately, these regulations were a response to large corporations doing these asset studies, and unfortunately there's no materiality level or no minimum level. Everyone has to adopt them. So they're here whether we like it or not, and they're applicable for years that begin after December 31st, 2013. So for those that are in a calendar year, we've got to look at these this year. And they address the tax treatment, whether to deduct or capitalize for things like materials and supplies, and then amounts paid to improve, acquire, or produce tangible property. And it's the year 2014, and we sort of need to look to see whether or not accounting methods need to be changed. And from an equine perspective, where do we see this? Who do we see this affecting? Basically, we think it'll affect farms with real estate and land improvements, affect companies that incur costs related to supplies, including tools, fuel, and general items. And it may not affect companies that only own horses. So I think there's limited applicability if you just purely own horses and don't have any related real estate or supplies expense that are incurred. It's probably limited for your purpose. Briefly, the materials and supplies piece, there's two types. There's incidental and non-incidental. The incidental is sort of what we've done in the past. We deduct. It means it's not inventoried or tracked. So if I'm buying supplies for the barn, I'm probably not tracking all the food that's there or the just general barn supplies. So that would still be deductible in the year paid as we normally do it. The other non-incidental materials and supplies, this is where I inventory or I track, and even though I use within a 12-month period, I'm required to basically deduct when I consume it. And the potential issue here, and the biggest one I see perhaps for farms, is on fuel. Most farms don't inventory fuel. It's deductible when paid, but may track it off the books just so you know when to buy more and things like that. So we've got to look and see if this may be an issue for some farms. It could be for vet practices if you've got a significant amount of inventory of meds for the horses on hand at year end. That could be an issue. And it's a very small amount. It's a $200 de minimis that you don't have to worry about. So if it's over $200, you have to consider these rules. Or it goes up to $500 per item if you elect what's called a safe harbor de minimis. And that's the next thing I'll talk about, which is you can use a election on an annual basis to deduct and not have to worry about whether to capitalize or expense anything that's less than $500 if you don't issue an audited financial statement, or actually up to $5,000 if you issue an audited financial statement or file something with the SEC, things like that. So what we see here is we've got, if you want to rely on this, if you don't have an audited financial statement, you need to use $500 or something less than $500. If you issue an audited financial statement or obtain one, then you can use up to $5,000 and annually elect this. And so you can change from year to year depending on your tax situation. But it may be that if I'm a farm that that gets an audit but doesn't really want to deduct up to $5,000, I can use this if I have a policy in place to deduct for $1,000 or less. I can use the safe harbor as well because I'm under the $5,000 limit. So farms should have a written fixed asset policy in place at the beginning of the year in order to qualify to use this. And either our firm or your CPA should have a template that you can use if one's not already in place. A couple other things with the regulations, they formalize maybe some things that we've already been doing. One piece is this acquired or produced tangible property. The regs have listed 11 costs that are now considered to be inherently part of the acquisition of the building. And so things like, or the tangible property, so things like shipping and appraisals, legal and tax advice specific to that building or property purchase, those all need to be capitalized into the cost of the property acquired. And again, it's probably something that you may have already been doing, but if not, then it's a change of accounting method for 2014. Unit of property, and of course we all have our acronyms, a UOP, and that's it's sort of the basis of everything for determining what what items should be expense versus capitalized. So the smaller the unit of property, the greater the chance an item should be capitalized versus expensed. And it really is utilized for a variety of different things. And in the regs, the building and leasehold improvements, building is broken down into 9 components. And I've listed some on the slide there and also in your materials. And for non-building assets, it's components that are functionally interdependent. So I think I put an example in your materials of a golf cart. You buy a chassis from one vendor and a battery from another. The unit of property is the golf cart because you can't operate one without the other. So that's just an example there. The next, repairs versus improvement. It's an improvement. The slides are on there. It's an improvement if it meets one of the following 3. If it's a betterment, an adaptation, or a restoration. And here, I don't see items for farms substantially changing here because there's a routine safe harbor maintenance. And I think we're going to rely on this for a lot of the things that you would see on a farm, such as repaving of roads and, painting of fences and barn painting in general. But basically, what this routine safe harbor maintenance says is that you may deduct certain routine and recurring amounts to keep a unit of property in its ordinarily efficient operating condition. And as long as you expect to do that at least once during the property's class life, then it qualifies as this under this routine safe harbor maintenance. And for buildings, that's 10 years. For land improvements, it's 20 years. For fencing, it's 10 years. So if you expect to repave your roads at least once in 20 years, then it should qualify as a repair versus an improvement. So again, I don't think for farms that changes much. There is an opportunity if you have been capitalizing things like painting and repaving of roads to be able to deduct whatever basis remains in 2014. So just an item there. The other item is just a partial disposition of property, and this is new as well in the regs. But this is an election that you can actually look at the undepreciated basis in a piece of property when it's replaced and actually write off that basis. So for example, if you replace a roof on a barn, if you go back to when it was originally purchased and can identify the piece of the barn that was the roof portion, you can write off that portion, which you weren't able to do under prior law. So this is actually a very positive thing. And overall, this is a pretty positive, these are pretty positive regulations. It's just going to take some time to comply with them and to adjust for 2014 and going forward. But once I think we get systems in place, it is a little bit more taxpayer friendly. And then going forward, just when you're trying to track these things and consider whether you can write off a portion of the barn or building, you might want to consider a cost segregation study if significant buildings are being paid for, or at the time that you pay for the building, having a contractor separately invoice or separately state what the cost of the roof versus the siding, things like that, helps you to better track that for your purposes. So from a farm perspective, what do we do when we're finalizing 2014 accounting? There's some opportunities because the IRS expects many people to file change of accounting methods to comply with these new regulations. So we're sort of using 2014 as our ability to go back and correct and update past issues. So 2014 is sort of the time before you file your return to handle what may have been correct under prior law, but now can be written off or expensed under the new law. So you want to review your depreciation schedules and fixed asset listings to see if there's anything that may be expensed under the new law, the new regulations, which you can do. You'll want to look at your repairs and maintenance account to make sure that you're expensing versus capital. You make sure that there's nothing that that's required to be capitalized. Look at your supplies to see if anything that was paid in 2014 remains unused, that's above the $200 or $500 threshold in 2015. See if we need to look at something like that or come up with a reasonable way to deduct everything in 2014. And then looking at if there was any significant replacements to buildings in 2014 to see if you might be able to at least partially dispose of the prior costs. So it's a very high-level review of TARs. Hopefully, it's not something that you've not heard of before. We've had proposed regulations for a number of years, and it's finally, we have to deal with it. It's here. So again, it's a very high level that we covered it on, but there's lots of intricacies. But I've tried to pick out what I think might be the big ticket items for that we're seeing on the farms. The next topic, switching to another hot button topic, is worker classification. And just a couple of thoughts on this. I'm just going to, for today, present the information. I'm not going to really provide an opinion one way or the other. I work with farms that do different things for different employees, and I can probably argue either way for a lot of these things. So I just want to put this out for you all to consider. And I do think it's a personalized decision and could be on a case-by-case basis. So we are seeing some pickup in this area, and kind of who looks at it. The IRS obviously looks at it when you're getting audited. They'll look at your employer classification. State tax departments, U.S. Department of Labor, workforce agencies, workers' comp, unemployment compensation. The IRS, Department of Labor, and states have begun to share information. So we've sort of seen that on larger cases. Here, the IRS, I'll focus on the IRS first. There's a 20-point checklist that focuses on three main factors. And that's basically the worker's behavior and work results. And here, it's not necessarily the outcome, because you all agree on the outcome. You hire a person to do a particular job. It's really, do you control that person the way that that person gets the job done? And so, how much say does the contractor have, or does the employee have in getting that in getting that job done, or are you primarily responsible for guiding how that person gets the job done? The other item is finances. So does the employer have the primary control over the person's profit or loss? Is the employee offering services available to the general public? The payment frequency, things like that. And then what is the relationship between the parties? Does the worker receive benefits? Is it a long-term or short-term relationship? So those are sort of where the IRS has focused. The Department of Labor and Social Security Administration is really focused more on dependence and degree of control, skill required, and permanency. So there's different tests that all the agencies use. There's 5 questions that the IRS has asked in court, and basically who recruited them. If you've recruited them, there's more risk. Who trained them? Again, if the company trains them, there's more risk. If the longer the duration of the employment, the more the risk. Do you have the right to assign extra work? If so, there's more risk. And do you have control over things such as firing, discipline, and rewards? And again, yes, is more risk. So not necessarily unexpected items. And just wanted to point out, I've listed here, our firm does a few surveys throughout the years, and the last survey we did was a pretty small one where we just did a electronic survey, and just wanted to point out where the farms are as it relates to classification of workers. There was a small amount that responded to this last one, but the majority treat the sales staff, jockeys, and trainers as independent contractors and grooms. It was almost a 50-50 split. Our 2012 survey, which was our last sort of full-blown survey, you can see that the majority of grooms were treated as employees, but the rest were treated as independent contractors by the farms. And this is a Kentucky-based survey, so it's specific to the Kentucky farms here. So there's some consistency in the industry, although I think where we've seen the most controversy is in the sales help classification area. The big relief that most have relied on from a classification perspective, I think, has been the Section 530 relief, which has been available since the 1970s. And essentially, it prevents the IRS from reclassifying a worker to an employee for payroll tax purposes if the business has a reasonable basis for consistently treating the worker and every other worker that performs the same job as an independent contractor. It applies, and the issue here is that it applies only for federal employment tax purposes. It doesn't cover any items, for example, employee participation in plans. It does not apply to laws administered by the Department of Labor nor to state laws. So it's really only it really only gets you out of the federal employment tax area, so it really doesn't protect you from a state tax perspective or Department of Labor issues. So in order to be eligible, you've got to consistently treat the same workers as independent contractors, report their income on a 1099, and then the business has to have a reasonable basis for treating the workers as independent contractors. And I think most have relied on the longstanding recognized practice of a significant segment of the industry to treat such workers as independent contractors. So that's also you can use if you've been through an audit and it's been successful, or if there's case law out there that supports your classification. But again, I think that's what most have relied on. Just some risks to be aware of if you do misclassify. There's some federal income tax withholding, state if the 530 relief is not available, state and local withholding, Social Security and Medicare, the employer portion, unemployment, workers' comp, employee benefit plans, and now we have to deal with the Affordable Care Act, as you all probably well know when you were renewing your health care premiums last year. But if you classify someone as an independent contractor versus employee, it could be that you're subject to penalties for not providing them with health care benefits. So just some items to be aware. As far as what triggers an audit of looking, when does the government come and take a look? It can be that there's just a general industry focus or audit focus. If you remember back a few years ago, the IRS did a bunch of payroll exams or payroll audits that started in about 2010. I think they're finally going to complete them, they said, in October of 2014. So they should be wrapped up, and the Department of Labor is getting ready to do a survey that's now scheduled for September of 2015 to address this worker classification issue item. So we'll see if they stay on track. The Department of Labor survey has been postponed a few times already. You could have a state unemployment claim filed by a contractor, saying that they're eligible for unemployment, even though they were coded as a contract labor versus an employee. A whistleblower, we've seen that on some, where they'll just go and just say that they really should have been a employee versus independent contractor. So another audit trigger is issuing a 1099 and a W-2 in the same year to the same person. So sometimes you can transition people from an independent contractor to an employee, and it's best to probably do that in 2 separate years versus issuing the same in that same year. So just some items to note. So what should you do now to address this? Basically, just review the factors. I think in my materials I included the 20 questions the IRS asks, and just review those factors to determine if you think it's an appropriate classification that you're using right now. Review any written contracts. Written contracts may be good or bad for independent contractor status. Sometimes the less that it's in writing, maybe the better. You change business relationships as needed if you need to address, doing things one way or the other, and then basically ensure proper documentation is maintained if you're treating people as independent contractors. Just make sure you've got your reasons why, so that if you do get a inquiry, you're able to address it. And I'll just make one note. There is, if you decide that you've been classifying workers incorrectly, there is the IRS does have voluntary classification settlement programs available. It involves going back and paying some penalties on prior years, and we haven't really seen many, if at all, take advantage of these programs because it's a little bit onerous to do so. So you've got to file an application and still pay some back employment taxes. So there's pros and cons to doing it. So I just mention it in case you have that issue. Just a couple of brief other compliance reminders. 1099s reporting. Basically, 1099s should be issued to anyone you've paid at least $600 for services, rents, or attorney fees. Common in the equine business, bloodstock agent, consulting fees, board, contract labor, legal fees, training, vanning, and vet. There's a filing exemption for service and rent payments made to a corporation, but that exception does not include LLCs, taxes, partnerships, and also partnerships. And something new that was new for last year, in case you, just as a FYI, basically late December of 2013, the IRS said that payments to incorporated vets met the definition of providing medical and health care services. And so even if a payment to an incorporated vet is made, a 1099 needs to be issued for that payment. The 1099 should have been mailed to recipients by yesterday, but the more important deadline is the end of February to the IRS, or March 31st if you're due it electronically. So just a couple of reminders on that. And I'll just make a comment on sales and use tax. Each state is different, as you all well know, and we've seen states come in and start looking at this a bit more. We have on our website, which I think I provided a link to, a multi-state equine sales and use tax, sort of by state, specific to each state's requirements for how they treat different things in the horse business. So feel free to use that, but just make sure if you're either you're on the selling side and you have a buyer that's exempt from sales tax, make sure you maintain the documentation. We've had some audits here recently where we've had to go back and recreate records, and it's just not as efficient as if those records existed at the time that the sale was taking place. So just make sure you document, much like a public auction house or Keeneland or Fasig would document. Make sure you document for those private sales that you're doing. All right, so that's it on the compliance side. I'll just go over a couple of quick tax incentives that may be helpful for you as you're thinking about your taxes. And sometimes some of these aren't new. They've been around for a while, but it's always good to just have a reminder in case that you qualify for these. But basically, from a farming perspective, raising, feeding, caring for, training, management of animals. So horse owners and breeders and trainers qualify. If a bloodstock agent is purely doing sales activities, that doesn't qualify. And then pinhookers may or may not qualify, depending on how involved they are with the development of the horse. So what does that mean? Well, basically, the cash method's available for most, and that's probably what you're already utilizing. And then if you generate a net operating loss and it's farm-based, you can carry it back 5 years versus 2 years. You also can use what's called farm income averaging, which if you've got a large sale in 1 year, you can go back for the 3 prior years and look at your tax bracket, and then you spread that tax effect over that based on those 4 years of tax rates. So you're not really hurt in your up years because you've got 1 or 2 great sales. You sort of look at your tax rate over a number of years, and you're able to spread that tax liability based on your tax rates during that time period. Just a brief mention on the new tax law that was passed at the end of sort of mid-December 2014. Probably heard lots about it. It was one of those ones that everyone kept saying they extended the tax relief, and that's true, but they really retroactively applied it to 2014 only. So it didn't address anything in 2015 or anything post 2014. So it basically is good for calendar year 2014 only. And then our key equine incentives that are available are the 3-year depreciation recovery period for all racehorses, so that for your yearling purchases, if you place them in service in the fall of their yearling year when they begin training, you can depreciate them in 2014. 50% bonus depreciation for qualifying services, so of new assets, so anything that was purchased new, and that would include yearlings. And then the increased Section 179 up to $500,000 on $2 million of purchases. So those, again, are just for 2014 only. I know it's on everyone's mind as to what's going on in 2015, and so that's something that will be addressed, we hope is addressed early on, sooner rather than later, because I think it was difficult to make any decisions after December 19th this year based on this new tax law. And one thing to note on this is that Kentucky does not recognize the 50% bonus or the increased 179. So this is a federal deal only. Just a brief mention on the Section 199 deduction. It's a 9% deduction available for basically the lesser of qualified production activities income or taxable income for the year. And qualified production activities income is domestic production gross receipts less the cost of goods sold, direct and allocated indirect. And so what's domestic production gross receipts? Well, it's basically gross receipts, sales of property that I've produced in the U.S. So it would apply to sales of horses that are produced here in the U.S. and does not apply to purely sales or services activities. But this is one where if you have a good year and you're selling homebred horses, then you could benefit from that. If you're pinhooking and your racehorses that are still racing, maybe it's a development or production of a racehorse, there are some limitations that apply. So you limit it to 50% of the W-2 wages that the entity pays. There's some passive considerations and then some related party rules. But I see this one missed quite a bit just because it may only apply to you may not have seen it in years past, but it could be beneficial in a positive year. Just a couple of things, and then I'll pass it over. But I just wanted to remind people because I've gotten a lot of questions lately, which I take as a positive sign of the market that people are interested in doing like-kind exchanges again. I saw more of these a while ago, maybe in the 90s when the market was really good. But haven't seen them in a while. And so, again, a like-kind exchange is where you can defer the gain on the sale of a horse if you invest it in like-kind property. And the primary issue here is it has to be done before the horse is sold. So I may not know what my horse is going to bring, but if I'm interested in doing a like-kind exchange, I need to transfer title to my qualified intermediary prior to the sale. And lots of questions about, well, does Keeneland qualify as a qualified intermediary? I really can't get my cash until they distribute it. So, and unfortunately, it does. Keeneland or a public auction house is deemed to be the seller's agent, and they do not qualify as a qualified intermediary. So you have to work with a third party before the sale. After that sale, I've had a lot of clients come through, and they've had a great sale and say, oh, I want to go reinvest this in horses. Unfortunately, it's too late at that time. You've got to set it up prior to the sale. And that's just a reminder. And you would not pursue this if you were selling a horse at a loss. You'd want to go ahead and take that loss. You wouldn't want to roll that loss into the basis of a new horse. And horses must be of the same sex, and also same use is preferable. And then horses used predominantly outside the U.S. are not like-kind with horses used predominantly within the U.S. That's just as we see more horses go overseas, we see that quite a bit. On the installment sale, this is applicable if you receive cash in a different year than when the sale took place. If you have a gain, you can use the installment method. If you have a loss, you actually report the loss all in the year in which the sale occurred, which is positive. Rather take the loss up front than have to defer it. It's not available for inventory type assets. And the exception here, it's a big exception, if you have taken any depreciation on that horse, that the part of the gain that's subject to depreciation recapture has to be reclaimed all in the year of sale. So if I sell a horse for an $85,000 gain and I've taken $75,000 of depreciation of that horse, I have to pick up the $75,000 of the gain in the year of sale, irregardless of when I get the cash. So that hits people, unfavorably sometimes if they're not aware of that. And the last thing I'll mention is just involuntary conversions, and that's basically when a horse dies and you receive insurance proceeds. If there's a gain, you have quite a bit of time to reinvest those insurance proceeds into similar or related in use products. So racehorse for racehorse, mare for mare, stallion for stallion. Basically that you have 2 years from the end of the year in which the insurance proceeds were received. So if you have a mare that's died in December 2014, you received the proceeds in January of 2015, you have till December 31st of 2017 to reinvest that in similar property. So some people like to do that because you defer the gain, and others would prefer not to have to keep track of reinvesting those proceeds. So it's up to you. And sometimes you'd want to pick those up into income if it's capital gain taxed at favorable rates. So again, some reminders there. I'll pass it over for insurance, and then if anyone has any questions at the end, just let us know. Thanks so much.
Okay, I'm not a public speaker, sorry guys, but that's what it is. Your insurance, your farm insurance, it consists of property and liability. And basically, your property you have a cause of loss, which it can be basic, broad, or special. Of course, with all insurance, you want to take the highest forms especially. So you want to do special and treat a special form of insurance, and this covers basically all forms except for the items that are excluded on your policy. So you need to look at your policy when you're looking at your insurance again. Casualty insurance, which is the second part of your property insurance, is the liability portion of your insurance. It's for negligent acts or omissions that cause bodily injury or property damage. And for that to happen, you have to have an occurrence, which is a one-time event. It can't be continuous in any shape or form. Otherwise, it's not considered an occurrence. I'm sorry that most of this was written for me. I'm not responsible for it. When most people in the insurance business, they're thinking about mortality. With farm insurance, you have property, liability, scheduled equipment, auto, umbrellas, and business income, sump pumps, computer coverage, and equipment breakdown. There's lots more, but those are basically what's covered in your policy. With mortality, you have an idea of what your horse is worth, and in liability insurance or farm insurance, you have no idea, because if you have someone that comes onto your farm, gets kicked by a horse, third party, you have no idea what they may sue you for, so you need to get the highest amount of coverage you possibly can get. With property insurance, you normally have a lien holder. That's your bank. They want to know, they have X amount of dollars they need to cover. You may have all that coverage in place, you may not, so we usually go in and we evaluate your property. We evaluate your barns by determining whether they are concrete block, wood frame, non-combustible steel. Are they barns? Are they a shed? Are they a pump house? What are they? You may have an idea of what they're worth. The insurance company has a different one. Insurance companies take a co-insurance clause in all their replacement costs and their ACV. This is what it should be insured for over what you have it insured for. So if you don't meet the co-insurance clause, you're going to be penalized. If your roof blows off and you don't have enough co-insurance, say it's a $10,000 claim, you should get $10,000 if you're 80% co-insurance. You only have it to 50, well, you're only going to get 60% of your money. So make sure when you look at your property each year that you feel you're adequately covered. Talk to your insurance agent. It's very important you do this because cost factors go up each year. Some companies do have a cost of living index built into your values, others do not. So make sure you really look at it. When you do your farms, some of you have residents, some do not. Make sure you look at whether if you have a residence that's a non-personal residence, a employee residence, are you carrying content coverage for your employee? Do you own the property that's in that house? Where is it? What do we need to do? What do we need to cover for that? The other thing that we need to know as an insurance agent, we need to know your loss history. What kind of losses have you had in the past? What are you looking at right now? Is it a property loss? Is it a liability loss? Because that's going to determine what your costs are. The only way we can help you is by determining the value and the cost of your insurance. Along with this loss information, we need to know where you are in relationship to a fire department. How close are you? Because we need to determine what the protection class code. If you're in Fayette County, usually we can get an idea on your PVA. Some of the other counties, we have more difficulty in doing that. Some of the things that we do add to your farm policy, we need to talk to you about it. Do you have electronic gates? Do you have fences? All of you have fences, sorry. Do you have hay? What do you have that we need to cover? Some of them are not coverable. Some are covered by endorsements that we add to your policy. So if you have like gate coverage, for example, lightning hits almost everybody, and gates are expensive. You normally blow out the control board. That's $1,000. On your policy, you may insure that gate for $10,000, $15,000. And then deductible is $1,000. On your farm, by an endorsement, we can add that coverage to you. You have a $250 deductible, and you're saving yourself $750. Good for some people, better for the smaller person. In the dwelling policy on your farm, there is what's called a loss of use. That is for when you are, if there is a claim, if there's an occurrence and an event happens where you have, say, a fire, that covers you while you are fixing your house. If you have to go rent another place, you have to rent a place for yourself, for your employee, that coverage comes in place to cover you while that dwelling is being fixed, and while you can, just covers your costs so you're not out of pocket. Most of your farm policies have a deductible. Most of them are $500, maybe $1,000. What you want to make sure you do is you really look at that value. Some farmers want to raise their deductible to $5,000, $10,000, even $25,000. The value of that, the cost of that value may not be in that extra deductible you're taking. If you're taking a $1,000 deductible and you're raising it to $5,000, you're only getting about 0.5% interest, so you're only saving yourself $1,000. It's kind of your choice on what you do, but why do it for $1,000? The other big thing lately has been flood insurance. A lot of your banks want you to have it. If you have a stream, water, you have to buy a separate policy. A flood policy is a separate policy that's done by FEMA or that you need to get. An agent can provide it to you, but it is a separate from your farm policy. Your farm policy does not cover flood insurance. If you have a flood, water damage, it will not cover it. The other aspect of your farm policy is your liability. Most of the liability policies, if you're one of the smaller farms, you may want to cover yourself minimally $300,000. There's $300,000, $500,000, and go up to $1 million. You can get higher limits by adding an umbrella. An umbrella goes over the top of it. I keep hearing people in our clients say, well, I've got an umbrella. Well, an umbrella doesn't do you any good unless it goes over the top of something. So your general liability is where you start. Your bottom tier is where general liability, so get as much as you can. Again, the liability is also the premium. You all want to cut costs. Premium on your liability is based upon your acreage, personal property, whether you have personal liability on it or not, whether you have a number of horses, whether private racing or whatever. You have payroll. Some companies use sales receipts. Most of the ones that we use, we try to use either payroll or horse related, so we can reduce your costs by. If you have a higher payroll, we may want to switch you to another company because the liability premium may be lower by using a number of horses. So those are the things you want to think about. One of the things that we really look at recently are private horse owners' liability policies. This is for your stallion syndicates, for your clients that have horses at the racetrack. That's an exposure that you really want to cover for some of your clients that are just own race horses. Recently, we've had clients that have been sued for people that bring their friends back after the race and want to show their horse off, and somebody gets too close, gets bitten or kicked, and then there's a lawsuit. And we're in the defense of it because they sue the owner, they sue the trainer, they sue everybody that they can, and Mr. Mosier gets involved in all that lucky stuff. So I mean, it's a real big thing to get horse owners. If you're a farm, you can add it to your policy by just telling the agent that you have race horses. The other big thing that we strongly suggest is a lot of people have personal lines, homeowners policies, and the smaller individuals do have homeowners policies. They may want to cover their liability issue. It's an issue because really and truly, if you are allowing your horses on a homeowner's policy, sometimes they may exclude them because they're considered an athletic event. If you have children and your children bring over their friends, the liability issue is much greater because, again, you have a third party involved, and it is not typical of a homeowner's, and sometimes they will decline it. A lot of the other exposures that included in these are you take your horses to a event. You want to go to the High Hope steeplechase, you take your horse out, you take it off your property. If you have a homeowner's policy, it is not going to cover the off-premise exposure. If you have a farm policy, most of the farm policies cover you on off-premise exposures, such as when you're going to the breeding shed or something like that. So you really want to look at your policy, talk to your agent, make sure that you have off-premise exposure. Then we get into your farming where you have non-owned horses. You have clients. You're not a private farm. You're bringing more and more non-owned horses on. Some of them have value. Some of them do not. We strongly recommend if you have non-owned horses on your farm, you get care, custody, and control. It's an exposure that sometimes not really covered under your farm owners with the private farm policy. It's just not covered. It's better that you get some sort of coverage, whether it's $5,000, $10,000, $100,000, $500,000, or $1 million. You're going to know the values of the horses that are on your farm and the number of them. The premium on that is based upon 20 horses usually, and it's based upon the value of the horse, the minimum value of the horse that you have on your farm. So if you have 10 horses and they're worth, one's worth $5 and one's worth $100, I would go with $50,000 to $100,000 to cover your exposure there. The other item that we have on that is a non-P&C, it's a different policy, is your workman's compensation policy. Jen talked about workman's compensation quite adequately, so I kind of hate to even discuss it, but when in the workman's compensation policy has two sections in it. It has a medical component and it has a liability component. The medical, of course, is to cover your employees, not independent contractors, but your employees. Those are the people that are under your direction, get paid by you, receive a check from you. Usually it's out of a payroll account, and it is it's just part of the law. And work comp is also part of the law. You have to have it. The other component of workman's compensation is liability. The liability exposures, if your employee gets hurt, he doesn't agree with what you are getting paid, say he's got a partial disability, a partial settlement, he may sue you. Or if he figures that he is an employee and really was an independent contractor, which we've had a couple of, then they may sue you. So the work comp company steps into your shoes and defends you in that lawsuit. It's very important that you have the work comp. The independent contractor, of course, as mentioned earlier, is someone that is not in your control. You're paying them on an invoice. You may have a contract with them. Hopefully you do. Because when you have workman's compensation every year, at the end of every year, they audit you. And the audit comes in and they take your payroll, and then they look at your independent contractors and everyone else that you may have. So if you have an independent contractor, there are various forms that you can get. We send out forms to our clients called an independent contractor questionnaire. And you have your contractor sign that. He fills out, gives you a social security number. Hopefully he's advertises somewhere so you can confirm that he's an independent contractor. If you have nothing at all, what happens is the auditor at the workman's compensation company comes in and states, well, your fencing man has employees. You can't just have one individual nail one end of the post and then go down and nail the other. So you have what they consider up the ladder coverage. And so they believe that they are on it and you're going to get charged a percentage of that invoice for that. So it's very important that you detail as much as possible your contractual relationship with independent contractors. Contracts are really helpful on that part. Or a certificate of insurance. If you have a certificate of insurance, usually you request a general liability, and to show they cannot, because it is a contract between the individual and the work comp company, they can show that they do have workman's compensation. It's very important that you do have that. In farming, normally we have 3 different types of employees. They're classified, and there's class codes for these employees. The employees, grooms, are classified under the class code of 8279. Various companies have different rates. I'll use the local one, Kimi. They have a standard manual rate, which is $5.85, I believe, right now. And they have a preferred rate that is $3.85 for that class code. It's based on per $100 of payroll. There are other people involved in your business. Your secretary, she's going to be considered clerical. That's under class code 8810, and that's 32 cents in manual and 18 cents in preferred. There are other people that you might want to think about when you're at the sales, since you're consigners. You have card carriers. You have people that are designated to show horses, not show horses with a shank or lead, but to provide cards, provide secretarial services. They're doing the computer work. Those we try to classify as sales, and usually we need a lot of backup information to provide that, but we can try to put that in as a salesperson. That class code is 8742. And it is $1 per $100 payroll, or in the manual, and then the preferred it's 57 cents. So basically, with work comp, the audit is very important. You need to know what you're doing with your independent contractors. You really need to pay attention there. You need to payroll. If you can do your best each year when you're talking to your agent, renewals are, for most people, are coming up on 2/28. For those that were fortunate to be with AIK Comp many years ago, your 2/28 renewal period, your work comp, you should have got your renewal already. It's very important that you give your agent as much information as you can, because you want to prepay it. I would rather have my client have an installment over 9 or 10 payments versus at the end of the year getting an audit and being requested to make a lump sum payment or spreading out over 2 or 3 payments. The other insurance that we have not talked about is auto insurance. Most of you have trucks. Most of you have employees. So what you need to do is you need to notify your insurance agent of the employee. You need to give them the date of birth, the date of birth, driver's license number, and the name. If you can send a copy of the driver's license, that's very helpful. We don't need Social Security numbers. A lot of people send Social Security numbers. We don't want them. We don't want them at all, because that gives us possible other information we just don't need. The reason why you also want to notify your agent on your drivers is you may have on your auto policy, you may have drivers that a clerical person that runs down and they pick up a contract at Keeneland, a FASI tipped, and they may be in an injury. So you want to make sure your agent has you down as rented, borrowed, non-owned coverage, because those are things that your employee may get in an accident and you may be liable for that incident. The other thing that we strongly recommend is that you get uninsured and underinsured motorists. We have had many incidents in the last couple of years where a driver has hit one of our clients and not had enough insurance, and so that nice new vehicle that he's got is maybe $50,000, and the insured has the person that caused the accident has $20,000 of coverage, and you're a little short. So uninsured motorists and underinsured motorists are keys. So we strongly recommend you do that. The best thing that we can tell, or that I can tell you, is that you need to sit down with your agent and discuss what exactly your farm does, what you do, when you do it, how you do it, and that allows us to try to formulate something that best suits you by either endorsements, if it's not covered, such as a pollution, if you have are next to a stream and consider you have a gas tank or something next to it that you might be polluting. You don't know about it now, but someone may in time notify the EPA about it, and they may come and knocking on your door. It's just the best thing to do is just sit down and talk to us and let us come out and look at your farm and then review your whole insurance policy. And that's all I have to say. Thank you.
Thank you, Del. We're going to try to cover really one legal issue, and that is the use of radiograph reports at the public auction sales. And we're going to do that in the context of all the law that's involved with the sales, so I'm going to kind of walk you through that. But before I do, I want to talk about how this issue keeps coming up. It first crossed my radar back in 2011. I was taking the deposition of one of our prominent equine orthopedic surgeons, and Mike Casey, who represents the Vets Malpractice Fund, was sitting there during the deposition and finished, and he said, you know, all my consigners are asking me to do these radiograph reports on the radiographs. Do I have any liability for doing that? I said, hell yes, you have liability for doing that. And about a year later, Dr. Jeffrey Burke asked Mike Casey and myself to speak to the Kentucky vets at their midwinter conference about the subject. Then in 2013, in this room, we spoke to the National Equine Law Conference, and I got a call from Mike Casey on Monday, and we're going to the AAP convention in Las Vegas in December to talk about it again. So particularly among the veterinarians, this is a topic of big concern. Why is it such a topic of big concern? Well, it has to do with what these reports are. And what they are, if you think about it, when you're selling horses, other than what you tell people about a horse in response to a question, this is the only subjective piece of information that buyers are getting at these sales. And because they're subjective, that creates legal issues. So the 5 areas of law that are involved with the sale in this context is contract law, fraud, negligence, negligent misrepresentation, which is going to be the most important thing I talk about, and breach of fiduciary duty. So what have the sales companies and the vets said about these reports? Well, both of them have issued public statements, either by something they've said in the conditions of sale or a disclosure in the catalogs. The AAP says, and the sales companies both take the position on the use and effect of the reports. AAP, the use of the reports has the potential to harm all parties. The buyer may not be adequately represented. The vet who wrote the report has no chance to explain his report. Modifying or deleting findings in the sales context is unethical and fraudulent. Radiographs taken should accurately represent the condition of the horse. Keeneland. It's very interesting to see what Keeneland's done when I talk a little bit later about the cases in Keeneland's exposure to liability and the Fasig-Tipton as well. In 2011, the conditions of sale of Keeneland did not mention radiograph reports. Now, I believe, and I'm not privy to their discussions about how they changed their conditions, but I believe the reason was they recognized that if they included that as information provided to the buyer in the sales context, they had a risk if that report was inaccurate or false. But in 2012, the conditions of sale changed. The reports were added as documents included in the repository, and a prohibition of the use of reports not on file in the repository was added to the conditions of sale. What I've heard generally is that Keeneland and Fasig-Tipton became concerned that reports different maybe than what was on being in one place were being shown to someone in another place, and that's why they decided to stamp these reports, put them in the repository, and try to control their dissemination. Condition 21 of Keeneland's conditions says the reports are subjective, which we've already mentioned. They're not a substitute for a review of the films, and Keeneland has no liability for the reports. Well, that's Keeneland's statement, but I don't believe that to be true. And the condition says if the reports are not accurate, valid, or authentic in all material respects and deemed to be materially misleading regarding the condition of the horse, the sale is subject to rescission. And if a complaint is lodged after the sale relative to what's in a report, there's an arbitration provision for a panel of vets to determine whether or not the report is defective. Fasig-Tipton followed suit. In 2012, they added condition 6, included the reports in the repository, the same statement about them having to be accurate and valid and not misleading, and also included a panel determination provision. Okay, so now let's walk through the areas of law and how this impacts all this. Contract law. The contract in the sales context is the conditions of sale. That creates the contract between the buyer and the seller. And the conditions of all the sales company exclude what we call implied warranties. Warranties of merchantability, warranties that the horse is fit for racing, those are all disclaimed. But what a lot of people don't realize is that you can't disclaim an express warranty. That makes no sense. Because if you say something affirmatively to someone, you can't just have a written statement somewhere else that says it doesn't mean anything. So Keeneland's conditions and Fasig-Tipton's conditions in fact recognize that you can have a side agreement between the seller and the buyer. It just doesn't bind the sales company. So express warranties are still in play. So how does that affect all this? Well, contract liability means that the contents of one of these reports may actually be an express warranty. That depends a lot on what's said in the report and how it reflects on the condition of the horse, but there can be an express warranty. Proof of a breach of an express warranty will require you necessarily to prove that the report is wrong, or it's incomplete, or it's inaccurate in some respect. So as the agent for the seller, which is what the vet is who prepares the report, the vet can be sued by the seller if there's something inaccurate or false or incorrect in the report. Now, we're going to get to third-party liability, which a lot of people don't realize is out there, but that is based upon the vet as the agent of the seller and typically does not provide for a direct suit against the vet because the principal that's selling the horse is disclosed. Therefore, the agent typically is not exposed to liability. So what's an express warranty? Well, there is something in the law that's called puffing. This is a great horse, okay? That's puffing. But these are express warranties. This horse has no problems. That's an express warranty. We'll stand behind any problem in that ankle. That's an express warranty. No significant finding. That's an express warranty. And where do you see those words? You see them in these reports. Not likely to affect training. You see that in these reports as well. That's an express warranty. So if it's in that report and it turns out not to be true, that's one cause of action that the buyer has to sue for, is breach of an express warranty. The second area of law involved is negligence. You all know about malpractice, professional negligence. That's what the vets are most worried about in this context. I've had 2 cases this year where vets wrote radiograph reports and missed a lesion. In one case, a huge lesion. They just missed it. And they both got settled immediately because there was no defense to that. It was clearly malpractice. The second area is negligent misrepresentation, which we're going to talk about in a minute. Both of these require a duty. But the law can extend that duty to people with whom you've had no contact. And that's what we're going to talk about when we get to the vet's liability to the buyer. Negligent misrepresentation. It's very interesting how this made its way into Kentucky law. This does not require any intent. You make a representation, it's inaccurate or inadequate or false, You don't mean to say it, it's just an accident, but nonetheless, there's liability. And it's very interesting because the way this made its way into Kentucky law was a case called Presnell Construction Managers, which cited the Chernick versus Fasig-Tipton case, which my late partner Harry Miller and I litigated in the 80s against Fasig-Tipton, which held basically that the sales company was liable for the accuracy of the information that was being presented to the buyer. And that case was cited to bring this into Kentucky law. What it means is that there is third-party liability for negligent statements. Now, where did that come from? It came from the Enron scandal in the 90s. The lawyers and the accountants were all writing these glowing reports about Enron's condition. And then when the whole thing fell apart and they got sued by the shareholders, they said, well, wait a minute, we just gave that information to the company. We didn't give it to you. And the court said, when you supply information to someone in the course of your professional responsibility and you know that they're going to give that information to a third party, you're liable to that third party if they're in that class of people that you knew were going to get that information. Moreover, disclaimers on reports are not effective as to those third parties, obviously, because they don't see them other than written there, and they're perhaps not even effective as to the client, which I'll talk about in a minute. So this is kind of a long and wordy provision, but this has been adopted by the Kentucky courts. And this is Section 552 of the Restatement of Torts. One who, in the course of his business, profession, or employment, meaning the vet, supplies false information for the guidance of others in their business transactions, buying horses, is subject to liability for pecuniary loss caused to them by their justifiable reliance upon the information if he fails to exercise reasonable care or competence in obtaining or communicating the information. That's the negligence aspect. So this is what really puts the vets in a difficult spot, because they've not only got the exposure to the consignor who they did the report for on the malpractice side, they've also got exposure to the buyer because they knew the buyer was going to receive the report at the sale. Now, what are the limits? The limits are the liability to third parties is limited to the group of persons for whose benefit and guidance the information was supplied. So obviously, it's a buyer at the auction and not someone else outside that context. And it's limited to intending the information to influence or know that the recipient so intends in a substantially similar transaction. Well, I think it's very difficult for a vet to argue that the report isn't going to be relied on by the buyer. The whole way this came up, the whole way these reports got onto the sales grounds was they became a sales tool. Then we have another body of law, which is fraud. Now, a lot of people don't realize this, but nothing in the conditions of sale at Keeneland or Fasig-Tipton affect a claim for fraud. It's an entirely separate body of law, and it cannot be disclaimed. What is it? It's a lie or a failure to speak, which means you get asked a direct question and you don't answer it. It requires proof of a material defect, and the buyer has to rely on the lie or the silence, and the buyer has to be damaged, and it can result in punitive damages. That's from the Chernick case. But what we litigated in Cohen versus Northridge, the seller is not under a duty to inspect the horse to discover defects in order to disclose them at the sale. That's the limitation of that rule. Now, fraud, the area of fraud law recognizes that people can act in concert to defraud. The reason that's so important is that if somebody sues a consignor for fraud in connection with what's in a radiograph report, they can sue the vet, they can sue the consignor, they can sue the seller, and they can allege that they're all in conspiracy in committing fraud. And that imposes joint and several liability, which means that if one of the defendants ends up being insolvent, you can collect all the money from the others. It does not require any direct contact, only knowledge of a duty to speak and the truth and not to remain silent. The buyer could include the vet in a suit for fraud, but he doesn't have to. Indemnity or malpractice claim still remains available to the seller against the vet. And finally, the last area of law is breach of fiduciary duty, and this is what hung Fasig-Tipton in the Chernick case many years ago. And the rule is that Keeneland and Fasig-Tipton must use reasonable care to ensure that the information contained in its sales catalog is accurate and comprehensive. And I would submit to you that once they made the decision in 2012, the sales companies, to put these reports in the repository, and they wrote a condition that said you were obligated to go look at what's in the repository, they put all of those reports within this rule. So what's the problem? Well, the problem is the only way you can avoid any of these liability issues is to have a perfect report. It's got to be complete and accurate in all respects, and it may not be possible. You know, one of the problems with where the vets are positioned on this issue relative to the reports and how they're set up is these are not standardized in any way. They list all the joints. They have you a place where you're supposed to write something, but they haven't broken that down into describing the lesion by size and significance and tried to standardize it in any way, which in the long run would probably protect them. The other problem is perfection's in the eye of the beholder. These reports are very subjective. Part of the reason they're subjective is there's still widespread disagreement in the scientific community about which lesions in a horse are really significant to that horse's future as a racehorse. And my wife always tells me the joke, this horse is okay to buy as a yearling, but not to pinhook. Well, what does that mean? So part of the problem is there's so much disagreement about the significance of these lesions that we can't get ourselves on the same page about how to create the perfect report. And predicting the future is a risky business. Now, what a lot of the vets have done, all of them actually, even the standard report that you see from Fasig-Tipton has this long disclaimer at the bottom about the report. The problem is there's no agreement with the buyer to those terms. When you hand that to the buyer in the shed row in the notebook, they're not agreeing to that disclaimer. It's there, but there's no contract to incorporate that term into an agreement with the buyer. There may be no agreement with the seller. The agreement was only to supply the report, not to absolve the vet of its contents. So I dare say that any of you that had a vet try to stand on that would be saying, well, you know, I never agreed that you could write an incorrect report. Perhaps you can get an indemnification from the seller. The caveat is you really can't contract against your own negligence. In Kentucky law, you can't just write these clauses that take away your liability. Now, negligence claims by third parties. This is a bigger concern for Mike Casey, but I wanted to mention it to you because this is on the minds of all the vets. Veterinary malpractice claims are the same as any other malpractice claim. You got to prove that the standard of care was breached, and you got to have an expert to say that. But the problem for the vets with this issue is what is significant. The subjectivity of these reports means that there's probably no vet that can get one of these claims knocked out by summary judgment. It's probably going to have to go to trial because it's a totally subjective question about whether there's a defect in the report. Damages. Under Kentucky law, horses are treated as items of personal property. So the damage measure is the difference between what you thought you were getting and what you actually got as a result of the negligence. Projected income from racing and breeding are components used to reach fair market value, but they're not separate elements of damages. Kentucky damage law is really strict about not getting into speculation about the value of something in the future. And this is the other big one that Mike Casey's worried about is administrative liability. There have been 8 cases of vets taken before the Kentucky Veterinary Licensure Board as a result of problems in reports that they submitted that were used at the sale. And the risk for Mike in representing those vets is there's a greater risk of harsh penalties because the aggrieved buyers are likely to allege that this was done on purpose. This was fraudulent. So this is a significant issue that's not going to go away. It's also creating a problem for the vets because every insurance policy typically has an exclusion for claims of fraud. So if I'm going to bring one of these cases, you know, I'm going to sue everybody involved, and I'm probably going to be able to allege fraud because there's going to be something so clearly wrong in the report that you can do that. And that exposes the vet to personal liability because their insurance may not cover that claim. So I know that sounds all grim and terrible. The truth is there's probably a way to fix this. I'm not sure what it is, but I know the vets are talking a lot about this issue. They're going to continue to talk about it. But in the meantime, you just need to be aware of what's out there. Thank you.
I would certainly like to thank this panel, and seeing as we have a little bit of time and we were just on a hot topic subject, if there's anybody that has any questions for any of the members, we've got microphones on either side of the aisle. Please feel free to ask. Yes, sir.
I have a question. An owner works at their house on that farm, and their interest personnel on that farm.
The personnel will be covered in the workman's compensation. It'd be a claim under work comp. Owner would, can't go though. Now, if it was a third party, say someone, again, that a friend brought on the farm and the horse got injured, they could sue. We've got a claim where a employee brought her friend on and a blacksmith was doing some work, and the blacksmith and the employee told the girl to quit standing behind the horse, not once, 3 times, and the third time the horse kicked her in the chest. She sued all parties.
Wayne?
Disclaimer that involved in our farms, access to our farms. Tell you all the time. But how does that play into our liability if someone's hurt on the farm?
Again, workman's compensation, if it's an employee, would come into effect. It'd cover that employee. Third, if a equine professional, vet, blacksmith, whoever, trainer, as long as it is posted, it, under theory, covers them. Of course, I would go to the individual over here who's going to sue everybody.
What it does is all it's designed to do, that's the Equine Hazardous Activities Act, all that's designed to do is reduce or heighten the burden that has to be shown by the plaintiff when they bring that action. They're going to have to show an affirmative act of negligence rather than claiming that the whole place and the horse was in your totality of control, and therefore anything that happened that injured them is your responsibility. But it's not a absolution of liability. If they can prove negligence, they can still sue you.
But the sign has to be posted.
Anyone else? Heedley.
Mike, what if the reports eliminated? Didn't be liability?
What if they were eliminated? That would solve the problem. You know, the difficulty for me understanding all this is I litigated those cases in the 80s that brought on board the repository. And I thought, this is going to solve it, because now all this objective information is right there for every buyer to see, and we've eliminated all the shenanigans. And the problem is, by introducing this subjective component, we've kind of taken ourselves back. And, you know, I don't know. I mean, I've never understood why the vets wouldn't want the additional money to go look at those films, rather than just have people look at those reports. I understand it's a sales tool late in the sale. You know, you get to the last couple of days of Keeneland, September, and there's a lot of horses that get sold because those reports are out there. But we got to find a way to solve the problem, I think.
Alfred?
Mike, just out of curiosity, what aspects of caveat emptor still apply to selling the horse?
Still exists at the sales, you mean? Well, if you buy a horse and you don't inspect it, and you know there hasn't been some misleading statement made, there's not one of those claims that I talked about, you're stuck with that horse. There's still caveat emptor in the purest sense, buying a horse under the conditions of sale with none of those other things that I talked about.
Okay, well, again, under the repository report, well, a lot of that is very subjective, and I've sold horses that become grade 1 winners and champions and have very significant issues, but the thing that seems to make the biggest point is who those horses go to after the sale. the trainers seem to have more control on what's going to happen to that animal than the consignment.
Yeah, I mean, that's the nature of the problem. That's why I mentioned the fact there's so much disagreement in the scientific literature about which lesions matter. And you know, until that gets to be more known, I think the vets are on a slippery slope even offering opinions about whether these horses are going to make it as race horses. I agree with you. There's been a lot of horses that had problems that went on and were champions.
Michael, just a quick question relative to the radiograph reports, and one thing that you mentioned, that the buyer does not enter into the agreement relative to the disclaimer on the report. As for these sellers that are sitting out here today, if they asked that buyer or a prospective purchaser that wants to review or look at that report to sign that disclaimer, does that then engage them into knowing and being a willing participant in the process?
It gives you an argument that that is now part of the agreement between the buyer and the seller. The problem is, though, all those Kentucky cases that say those disclaimers are ineffective.
Fair enough.
You know, you can't put a zip line up and have somebody sign something that says, you know, if I get hurt, you're off the hook, and have it be enforceable. If you can prove negligence, it's not going to be enforceable.
Understood.
So if we got rid of the reports, but we take the x-rays of the horses, us as owners need to know what the results are. A veterinarian is going to give us that report in writing. How does that affect the situation? Because we have knowledge of what this horse's, you know, deformity or irregularities.
You're on pretty good ground there, Craig, because if all that happens with the report, which is how this started, was you want to know what the horse is like before you take him to the sale, because people are going to be looking at the films, and you get the report from the vet, and it never comes to the sales grounds. And nobody ever comes to you and says, what about this lesion, and, you know, are there any lesions in this horse? Any problems in any of his joints? Well, when you're asked that question, then, of course, to the extent you have anything in that report that's material that the vet has pointed out to you, you need to say something about it. But if you're never asked the question, you don't have any liability exposure. The report's not in the hands of the buyer. You haven't been asked a direct question and told a lie or been silent. You don't have any liability. And that's where we ought to be, frankly. We're just not there right now.
All right, again, then that takes us back to subjectivity. You're relying on your veterinarian's opinion, and you're telling that to a potential buyer, even though you don't have the report. What's to say he buys the horse and takes separate radiographs to go down to the repository, and he doesn't agree with what you say, and they can take it on and purchase the horse. This is a post-purchase.
Well, I think there's a lot of that goes on. I think part of the problem with the process we're in now is people are not employing their own vets to go look at the films. I mean, I've got major racing clients who paid hundreds of thousands of dollars for horses last year that never vetted them. Some of them scoped them, but a lot of them never looked at the films. They just read the reports. So the perfect storm is a yearling goes through the ring for $1.2 million. All they've done is look at the report. They take it back to the shed row. They have their vet x-ray the horse, and he says, well, what about this lesion in the stifle? And they go look at the report, and they decide, well, yeah, it says there's a lesion there, but it doesn't say anything else. And then this argument starts about whether the report's misleading. That's the problem. You know, I'm agreeing with you. You know, you're relying on what the vet tells you, and if they don't do their homework, shame on them. But the problem is that the sales company are now blessing these reports as part of the information they supply to the buyers, just like the catalog. That's what Chernick was about. Said the mare was barren. She wasn't barren. She slipped. So, you know, that's the problem. And I don't know, again, I'm pleading my inability to solve the problem. I don't know, other than what Headley suggested, which is go back to where we were and get these reports out of the sales arena. I don't know how to solve the problem.
I mean, that's still, to me, if you have some, you know, if you have knowledge, supposed knowledge, and it's subjective, you could, you know, you physically tell it, or maybe yes, maybe this is without reports. I'm saying.
Well, and that's kind of the lesson of Cohen. you know, Cohen was $1 million yearling. The horse had a bad throat, but Northridge had never scoped the horse. So, and they weren't asked a direct question. The buyer of the horse just came and bought the horse. So, but if that buyer had come in that case and said, is this horse's throat fine? And they had said, as far as I know, they wouldn't have had any liability. If they'd scoped the horse before the sale, they knew he had a bad throat, and they were asked that question, then they've committed fraud to give the wrong answer to that question. I mean, that's just how the law works on that.
Mike, do you have an estimation of how many cases have come up as a result?
You mean as far as actual cases in the sales? I've had 3, and you know, Headley, just to play that out, 2 of those played out in doubles. You know, I got the case right when somebody bought the horse. I had one guy who sold the horse, okay? He sold for a nice number in September, and the guy took it back and looked at it and had it x-rayed and said, you know, this report doesn't disclose this lesion. Went through the panel, had to take the horse back. Step 2, we went to the vet who wrote our report and said, what the hell? He said, I missed it. We settled the malpractice claim against the vet. So the way this has been working is the ball keeps rolling down the hill, and it's always ending up with the vet. Because the vets are creating the report, and the report is subjective, and that's where the liability is. Well, in my mind, the problem is that the reports are open to other things besides just sloppy workmanship. The reports create an opportunity to commit fraud. Let's face it. I mean, I had a case, the woman didn't sue, she just let it go. But I had a case where a report was whited out and something else was typed where something else once was. And we had copies of both the prior report and the other report. So, you know, anytime you can't do that with an x-ray. Maybe you can. I mean, there's probably some technology that you can, and there have been cases at Keeneland where people haven't done the views exactly right, and they've been called off on that. But these reports are nothing but a piece of paper with a human being's words on them. So there's great opportunity for other things besides just sloppy workmanship, which is another reason it's not good to have them.
Any further questions? Ben? Whoop. I'm sorry, Kathy.
Let's go back to the liability issue. Consigners and owners often say, let's say we get rid of the horse, but we have the horse, we know what our horse is. If a buyer comes to me and says, how's your horse, knowing that I know what's on those reports, am I liable?
If they come and say what?
If they say, how's your horse? And we don't have reports.
And they just say, how's your horse?
Yeah, and they do that often. How's his
Well,
horse?
I mean, unfortunately, it gets down to the dirty dialogue. Well, what do you mean, how's my horse? There he is.
Yes. But what if I say the x-rays are in the repository? Am I liable, even though I know that there's something on those x-rays?
And that's kind of going back to Craig's point. You're entitled to have information that's superior to the buyer about your animal. That's not the problem. The problem only arises when you put yourself in a position where the information that you supply to the buyer is not truthful, complete, or is accurate, or you're asking direct questions and tell a lie. So, I mean, that's where the law been for. You can't sell a horse in these land books without a report. That's when you come up. That's just why I want to make sure everybody can hear what it is.
You cannot sell horses in the ladder books without these reports. That's the way we made it. So we're thinking about changing this over 2 or 3 instances?
Well, no. The other thing I suggested that could be done, but the vets will have to do it, is that they could standardize these reports. You know, look at human medicine. If you go to the doctor, they got a form, it's 18 pages long. The doctor's got it in front of him, and he asks you a bunch of questions.
And there's only certain answers that can be given to each of those questions. You can do the same thing with radiographic findings, size of lesion, proximity, all those things. And if you standardize all that and get away from this kind of vague, oh, this or that stuff, then maybe these reports become more reliable. Maybe they become less subjective. But you do that through standardization. That's the other way you could do it. But what I'm saying to you is there's a lot of this going on that you don't hear about. I hear about it every sales cycle. And I don't know, there's probably somebody here from a sales company could tell us how many arbitrations there were in Keeneland September, but it's happening. And you know, I'm like everybody else. I want the industry to thrive. I want these horses to get sold. And as I said, we don't know yet for sure what lesions really impact a horse's ability to race. But we got to keep the integrity level where it needs to be, or we're going to lose people along the way.
I'm just a boy from Louisiana. I got a farm in Bourbon County. You got to realize who these buyers are. You're talking about people from Oklahoma, Louisiana. All these people in here are not who. The books 1 and 2, that's not the problem. But you got to think of who the buyers are. This is a 10-year process. I mean, you can't just come in here and change that to these people from South America and these regional guys that are coming to buy these later book horses.
Well, and I understand that,
I mean,
and I understand that.
It's a different mentality.
I understand, and a lot of people aren't going to spend the money to go look at all those films. I get that. But if that's the problem, then what we need to do is standardize the reports. They need to be as bulletproof as what the doctor does, so that it's not NSF and nothing more, okay? If there's something there, you have to put it down, you have to describe it, you have to say where it is, you got to say what the size is, and then you got little boxes you can mark about how it affects the suitability of the horse. But we can't just stay where we are, is what I'm saying. And the reason is, I mean, this is a field day for the right case for a lawyer, and it'll be bad for the business. Because if what's out in the paper is this horse was sold, Keeneland had a report in its repository that was false, yeah, I mean, that just doesn't look good for the business.
Okay, in the essence of time, we're going to take 2 more. First, we're going to take Ben Berger in the back. Okay, all right.
Does the sales company punish? Does the sales company punish? Yes, the sales company actually has a condition that was added about 6 years ago that says that if a person comes and complains to the sales company that someone involved in the sales process has engaged in fraudulent or dishonest conduct, the sales company has the right to take several sanctioning measures against them, including barring them from any future auctions. To my knowledge, they've only done that with one person, and both sales companies did it. And that was about 3 years ago. Well, I think the sales companies have been really good lately about watching what people do at the sales, and if they see conduct that they really think is fraudulent or dishonest, doing something about it. But that only covers that very narrow group of fraud cases. It doesn't cover all this negligence stuff I've been talking about. That's just people making stupid mistakes. But it's still creating liability, and it's still creating lawsuits, and still creating problems. But I think the sales companies really, in the recent past, I mean, I've been around this business for 30 years, and to my knowledge, they never kicked anybody out of the sales until recently, but they've done it.
Okay, in the essence of time and to keep us on track here this morning, we're going to end this panel today. I would like to thank all the participants for speaking this morning. Thank you.